زكاتك تدفع عنك البلاء وتحفظ مالك أن أقام.
الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to part 4 of the short series on contemporary laws related to Zakat. Today we will be discussing those assets that are subject to Zakat broadly in principle, and then we will be looking at the specifics of cash, gold, and silver, and how we treat those for Zakat purposes. Just a refresher, how do we calculate our Zakat? The Zakat is calculated by multiplying one's Zakat base by 2.5%, and that gives us the actual Zakat liability, the amount that needs to be discharged to the poor. How do we calculate the Zakat base? This is equal to one's zakatable assets less any deductible liabilities from the side of the Sharia. Once we do that, we have the Zakat base, and that is the amount on which we calculate the 2.5% Zakat liability on. Now, when we deep dive into the assets that are subject to Zakat, there are a few principles from the side of the Sharia that we need to bear in mind that makes an asset subject to Zakat. Firstly, the type of assets or the categories are stipulated from the side of the Sharia. Not all assets will be subject to Zakat. There's specific conditions that are attached to them. Number two, the Zakat payer must be the complete owner of the asset. Part ownership or restricted ownership would not necessarily result in Zakat being payable on that asset. The ownership must be unrestricted, and the assets must have an opportunity to grow in wealth. The Zakat is only subject to those assets that have an opportunity to grow in wealth. So if we look at what assets generally are subject to Zakat, cash in all its form is subject to Zakat. Gold and silver are subject to Zakat. And when it comes to precious metals, these are the only categories of metals that are subject to Zakat. Any assets that have been purchased with the intention of resale. So if we take the example of a cell phone, if a person is purchasing a cell phone for his personal use, this cell phone will be subject to Zakat. But if a person is purchasing the cell phone with the intention of resale, he sells cell phones, whether that's his primary or sideline business, then the value of the cell phone will now be included as part of his zakatable assets. And Zakat is also levied on livestock and agricultural produce, which we won't be covering necessarily in these sessions because of the complexities attached to them and the unique situations that apply to them. Assets that are not subject to Zakat are any assets that are for one's personal use, one's home, one's vehicle, cell phone, clothing, etc. These are for personal use, and therefore they are not subject to Zakat. And assets that have not purchased for resale. So if somebody buys a second investment property, for example, a flat or an apartment, and his intention is not to sell that asset, then the asset will not be subject to Zakat. Even if he changes his intention later on and decides to put that asset onto the market, but at the time of purchase, his intention was to use it or for personal use and not for resale purposes, then too, that asset will not be subject to Zakat. Now, when we talk about cash, any physical cash will be subject to Zakat. Any cash in one's bank account will be subject to Zakat. And if somebody has foreign exchange, then the physical foreign exchange in cash and any amount that is kept in a bank account, whether it's an online bank account, an offshore bank account, that will also be subject to Zakat. And one needs to convert that foreign exchange currency into the currency that is being used for one's Zakat. For example, if one is calculating it in rands, then the spot rate on the Zakat date will be used to translate that foreign exchange into the currency that is being used for Zakat. When it comes to gold, silver, and jewelry, we need to understand that Zakat is only payable or due on gold and silver. So other forms of precious metals will not be subject to zakat. The method of calculating the zakat is to get the weight of the gold or the silver. So not the market value of the jewelry item, but rather the weight of the gold and silver, which can be provided to you by a jeweler. The commodity price for that item, so if it's gold or silver on the zakat date, needs to be utilized, and that needs to be translated. Generally, it's quoted in dollars, so it would need to be translated into the currency that is being used to pay one's zakat on the zakat date, similar to the foreign exchange discussion we had earlier. Important point to note is that if somebody has gold plated jewelry, that is not subject to zakat. So zakat is not due on gold plated jewelry. 9 karat gold, although the value of the gold is less than 50%, there is a discussion on this, but many of the ulama of the opinion that zakat is due on 9 karat gold. However, one would need to calculate the gold value that is included in there, and this can be obtained from the jewelers. If somebody has Kruger coins in their possession, the selling price of the Kruger coins on the zakat date or the nearest related date can be used for one's zakat calculation. So in this session, we looked at which assets are subject to zakat. We looked at particularly how to calculate zakat on cash and its forms, including foreign currency, as well as on gold and silver and items related to that, like Kruger coins and jewelry. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.